Hello, bonjour. My name is James Milner. I'm a professor of political science at Carleton University, and I have the real privilege of being the project director of LERRN. LERRN is the Local Engagement Refugee Research Network. It's a partnership between researchers, civil society partners, refugee leaders in Canada and in other parts of the world, but with a particular emphasis on responding to the needs and opportunities that are identified by our working groups in the Middle East and in East Africa. Through research, training, capacity building, and policy engagement and public dialogue, we're working to better understand and enhance the role of civil society in the functioning of the refugee regime, especially in pursuit of protection and solutions both with and for refugees. And I'd like to begin this webinar by recognizing that the land on which I reside and on which Carleton University is located is the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I say that not just out of protocol and out of deep respect, but to really emphasize that these questions of power, of voice, of relationships, that these questions that we're discussing today are very much part of the history and the ongoing struggle and pursuit of reconciliation on the territory where I reside. And with that, let me say how delighted I am to welcome more than 70 registrants from around the world and our panelists for our this final webinar in the LERRN-RRN webinar series. The goal of this series has been to contribute to this growing conversation within the field of refugee and forced migration studies on the need to do research differently. This is a call that's been building since B.S. Chimney's critique in the late 1990s of the geopolitics of refugee studies, the work of the Refugee Research Network under the remarkable leadership of Susan McGrath, and growing calls to address the power asymmetries that have conditioned research on forced migration. Our discussion in this series builds from the work of many others, including the 2019 IASFM Code of Ethics. What we hope to do in this series is to take a deeper look at the various stages of the research process and benefit from a diverse range of perspectives. Through this series, we hope to contribute to building a community of practice dedicated to supporting ethical and relevant research on forced migration, to sharing best practices on designing and conducting research, and offering practical guidance to researchers who are designing their research projects. So in this series, we've looked at a number of topics. We've looked at what counts as knowledge and how to build and sustain partnerships in the research process. We've been introduced to new research methodologies and have been challenged to think deeper about questions of positionality. I encourage you to have a look at the website, LERRN's website, and the link of webinars, which you see in the chat box there, to access reports from all past webinars and to access recordings of those webinars which were recorded. And so this is the last webinar in the series. And in this last webinar, we want to examine the structures of research and forced migration and ask how these structures can be changed. So what we've seen in the earlier sessions within this series is focusing on what individual researchers can do. What agency do individual researchers have in terms of the partnerships they develop, the way they design research, how they access and understand questions of knowledge? And while these changes on the part of individuals are important, we recognize that some of the challenges are deeper and more structural, like unequal access to research funding and conditions placed on research by donors. This was at the heart of Lauren Landau's critique of the political economy of forced migration that was in the edited collection, Mobilizing Global Knowledge. And you can access the book for free through the link to the University of Calgary Press. Landau in his chapter argues that so long as donors control the topics that will be researched, research will reproduce the policy priorities of donors and will not be responsive to local realities. But we note critically and with hope and with optimism that some of these structures are changing. Some donors are piloting innovative initiatives, like Canada's International Development Research Centre, which has established research chairs on forced displacement with direct funding to scholars in various regions of the Global South to pursue their own independent research agendas. For details of this initiative, we'll post in the chat a link to one of the recent calls for, there it is, for calls for research chairs in South and Southeast Asia and Latin America. That call has closed, but by looking at that call, you'll see the logic behind that work. And likewise, the German Development Institute and a range of partners in Germany have launched the FFVT network, which includes a goal to internationalize the field of refugee and forced migration studies. The link to that is in the chat box. So what we now have, we have a Canadian and German partners developing innovative approaches that can potentially challenge the structures that have conditioned research for so long. And so this nascent change within the structures prompts the questions around which this webinar is framed. What is the role of donors in addressing the issues that we've been talking about throughout this series? What would it take to get more donors on board with innovative efforts and initiatives like direct funding to local researchers? What are the structures that need to change? And how do we go about doing it? And we have 4 excellent speakers with us today to try and help answer these questions. And I'll introduce them to you in a moment, but first, let me just remind everyone of some practicalities and etiquette in relation to the running of this webinar. First of all, please note that this webinar is in the view-only format. So I encourage you at any point during the webinar to pose questions and to respond to the conversation using the Q&A function in Zoom. And there's a reminder of that. You'll find the Q&A function down at the bottom of your screen on your Zoom interface. But I would also ask you to please be respectful in posing your questions in the Q&A box. And I'd remind you that the inappropriate behavior or the use of hurtful or hateful language will lead to your removal from the webinar. So please be considerate of me, the moderator, and the speakers, and also of the opinion of others. Second, if you have any technical issues during the webinar, please send an email to learn@carleton.ca. That will come up in the box. And third, join the conversation on social media, on Twitter, by tagging @learning. That will be up in the chat box in just a moment. Last 2 points, the webinar will be recorded and posted on LERRN's website in the coming weeks, so watch for an update on that on Twitter. And finally, you will receive a survey at the end of this webinar. Please take a moment to complete that so that we can find ways to make the webinar experience more interesting and more valuable for you. So with that, we hope that you enjoy today's webinar on challenging the structures of refugee research. And as I said, we're very fortunate to have 4 exceptional speakers to help us engage with this topic. First, we have Susan McGrath, Director of the Refugee Research Network, Professor Emerita of the School of Social Work at York University, and past Director of the Center for Refugee Studies at York University, and past President of the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration. A real champion within the field who has been working on these issues for a very long time and really lays the foundation upon which so many of us are now working. I'm also delighted to welcome Maha Shoaib, who is the Director of the Center for Lebanese Studies at the Lebanese American University. She's joining us today from southern Lebanon, so we can all be very jealous of the beautiful sunshine and the backdrop that Maha is sharing with us. Maha is also British Academy Chair of Refugee Education and leads LERRN's Lebanon Working Group. And her work on research ethics and research partnerships has really challenged us to ask deeper and more provocative questions on the topics we're engaging with today. Third, it's a pleasure to welcome Jorn Grevenhold. He's a senior researcher at the German Development Institute, where he's currently involved with the FFVT initiative that we mentioned earlier. He's also a member of the German Advisory Council on Civilian Crisis Prevention and Peace Building, and really has been at the interface not only of the relationship between donors and researchers, but also of researchers and policy conversations. And in the midst of current events in the European context that has been placing a significant demand on Jorn's time, we're especially grateful, Jorn, for your presence here today. And last, but certainly not least, is our dear friend and colleague, Roula El-Rifai, who is a senior program specialist in the Democratic and Inclusive Governance Division at Canada's International Development Research Centre. Roula's been a passionate advocate for refugee issues within the Canadian foreign policy community for more years than I'll say publicly on this call. But her work has really been just pioneering in thinking through responses to the question of Palestinian refugees over the years. And it's been such a pleasure and a real honor to work with Roula over the past 4 years in supporting IDRC's significant re-engagement with forced migration issues. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for making the time. I'd like to begin, Susan, by posing the question to you. The experience of the RRN and as documented in the edited collection that we'd made mention to earlier, has really highlighted how structures really condition and affect the scope and the substance of forced migration research. And I'd like to begin with your reflections on the importance of these structural factors, how you've seen the interests of donors influencing the direction and the sustainability of forced migration research, and what lessons we can use to foreground our conversation today. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, James. And I'm very pleased to be here, very honored to be on this panel of people who are really providing strong leadership in the field today, and looking forward to the conversation and discussion. I'll go back to the book that James mentioned, co-edited with Julie Young, and because it presents some of the stories of some of the challenges that people have had in trying to do research and to form research networks, particularly my colleagues in Colombia, who had a great plan in terms of having a network in the region in Latin America. But it became very difficult instrumentally, but also lack of funding. And that while here in the North, and when I use the terms North and South, recognizing these are not homogeneous monoliths, but it's a terminology that can be useful sometimes. But higher income countries like Canada, where we can rely on research funding, we can apply for it, and we have a really steady source. But our colleagues have often, these countries have their governments have no capacity to fund research. And so they so much rely on trying to reach out and work with colleagues in the North. And I think one of the things we found in terms of feedback we got from our colleagues were, and the picture of the book is sort of says it, because they said it need to have more branches and less roots. The really importance of looking locally, regionally, and working to recognize that our local researchers are the ones who are the experts. They're living it. They're there day to day. And how do we then optimize their capacity to produce the research and share it? I think I want to point out the difference in capacity in terms of researchers in the North and in the South. And we often forget it, so we have access to research assistants. We have infrastructure of administrative support. We can rely on internet, usually computers and printers and consistent electricity. And colleagues I work with often have to do other jobs. I worked with a colleague, he was writing science fiction books for children in order to supplement his income, because his income was very modest in terms of what he was getting. My colleagues in Rwanda often do extra research on the side. And this is despite they have huge teaching loads and also have a lot of administrative responsibilities. And again, working in a context that there isn't a lot of administrative support. A colleague just this morning sent me a note about researchers she's been working with at a university in the South who need to get permission to apply for grants or even participate in a research project. And the approval process can take months. So there are often these contextual barriers and challenges that, and I think when we in the North, we call up a colleague in the South and say, oh, do you want to join us in this project? are often unaware of, and they won't tell you about it. They will just, oh, we'll try to negotiate with you. So I hope that they're better understanding, but I think it's really also understand the different contexts, and we'll hear some today, like with the area that Maha works with. But I remember working with a colleague in Sudan. He was trying to fill out a funding application to the EU, and it was one of these fillable forms that couldn't be saved, and his power kept going out, so they kept losing it. So finally, I ended up filling out the application in my office in Toronto with him on the phone telling me how to do it. So these are these challenges and barriers that are often we don't always appreciate, and I think we really need to be aware of. Again, with colleagues in Rwanda, I was there one day, it was when there was the conflict in Burundi, and people are crossing the border, and my colleagues were taking these families into their own homes to provide support. So I think it's, and I know others know about this, you who are working in the South are aware of this, but I think for us in the North, and as researchers, when we're reaching out and working with funders and looking for colleagues to work with in the South where the experience, where the displacement is happening, we often forget it. But there are also differences among high income countries. Working with colleagues in the UK and even often in the US who have to get research money to pay for part of their salaries. So they're really having to be aware of, looking for funding that will do that. And we're fortunate here in Canada, we don't have to do that. But it can be a real challenge. And this becomes then, what kind of research do you apply for? Because this is going to do the research you want to do, but also then if you have this sort of expectation that you will then get your own salary, and which funder is going to be able to pay for that. I should mention some of the administrative challenges that I think donors may not always be aware of, but when we're trying to administer funding and having difficulty getting funding into some countries, sometimes getting it out. I won't say how sometimes we got money in and out of countries, but it's a real challenge in terms of just some of the barriers, administrative barriers. And I know our research accounting people, have big standards in terms of how determining the money is being well managed, but the bureaucratic expectations can be excessive, and especially with colleagues who have a very little administrative capacity in their universities. I guess a final point I want to make in terms of the importance of recognizing graduate students and emerging scholars. And we really need to recognize the uniques and their needs and ensure that there's some funding. And they don't often have the profile, of course, that more senior scholars have. And we've been working with the Emerging Scholars and Practitioners on Migration Issues, ESME. This is a network of new and emerging scholars globally. It's been in place since the time of the Refugee Research Network. They just produced the 5th edition of their online journal, Refugee Review, but are really struggling in terms of keeping themselves going. And so I think there's looking at funding, not only to actually doing research, but how do we support networking? How do we ensure that there are spaces for researchers to gather? And we've learned this last couple of years during COVID, the advantage of virtual engagement. And I think how do we keep doing that? But that takes also at least it's not as expensive as getting together in person, but it takes funding in order to do that. But also to keep these networks going, they need administrative support to just to reach out, to engage, to keep websites going, to help organize, meetings and engagement, to set up these webinars and create spaces to keep a journal, an online journal going. And that journal is completely open access, by the way. So I think how we can think different about the challenges and opportunities about supporting research, but research that is truly global, inclusive, and ethical. So with that, I will pass it back. I think looking forward to conversations as we go forward.
Thank you so much, Susan. And I think that intervention really underscores the question that when we talk about the structures of research, it's not just the structures of research funding, but it's very fundamental questions like access to reliable electricity, the infrastructure that we often take for granted in the Canadian context, structures of remuneration. Opportuna Kweka is with us from the University of Dar es Salaam, and I remember when I visited the University of Dar es Salaam and needed to get something printed out, racing from building to try and stay ahead of rolling blackouts, to get a printer to work. Mark Akello from the Dadaab Response Association is on the call with us as well, and the way that Mark and colleagues have engaged in webinars in a remarkable way, but from the capacity constraints that they experienced in the Dadaab refugee complex, are go beyond the question of who can access funding, but sort of the infrastructure that's in place to engage or to sustain sort of all of these enterprises that often we take for granted. And with that, Maha, I'd like to turn to you because the situation in Lebanon really underscores these questions of structures and of infrastructure and capacity, and the way the Center for Lebanese Studies has managed through not just the past year, but the past several years of these infrastructure challenges are quite remarkable. And with your leadership at the center, there's been, that experience has prompted these deep questions about the structures that condition engagement in research processes. So Maha, with that, I'd like to pass the floor to you to get your thoughts on the themes of this workshop. What do you understand to be the structures that are inherent in conditioning research in this field? Maha, over to you, please.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to join you today. Okay, so my positionality in answering this question, I'm a researcher moving between a global north and south. And I've recently taken a position of the bilateral chair, which is a position where I have to divide my time between global north and south. The reason I'm mentioning this, because I think the structures in both places sometimes impede, impede the kind of collaborations and the ethics of partnerships and collaborations. But let me first start by saying, as someone who comes from education, that's my discipline, where all my training has been, and most of my research has been, except in the past 10 years. I'll have to say what I've learned by doing research on forced migration, and I think we should really, I know people are very critical of this field, but I think there has been more criticality in this space, more than I've ever seen, particularly concerning issues of partnerships, power dynamics, etc. I'll tell you, at the faculty where I'm based, there's hardly any discussion. When we talk about research ethics, it's about students. It's not about us. It's not about partnerships. So I think it's good, and we should build on what we have built. So this is something where I would like to start. And I think other disciplines and other fields of studies need to engage with this. We don't have any research ethics guidelines in the field of education that discuss power dynamics or the relational aspects of the research ethics or the publication aspects. So that's one part. And I think this critique in the field of forced migration has resulted in a shift also in the funding. So now you're beginning to see more funding that says, 10 years ago, I wouldn't be able, as a scholar based in the Global South, to apply and be the PI on a research grant from the Global North. So I would have to go and find someone or build relationships over time. And in most cases, it worked quite well. In other cases, it was really terrible. Or the other way around, it's, as we've discussed before, James, is like you find people reaching out to you just in, trying to find someone just as a tokenistic where, they need a partner. Only last week, I had to write an email to a partner saying, we don't want to be an operational partner. We're not here to do that job. I haven't got an answer about it. There isn't even a willingness to engage in this and challenging this structure. So in one way, there's a structure that is in the Global North that looks at partnerships in a particular way. I think in certain disciplines, it's even more archaic than others, but generally, it still exists in development a lot. So that's one thing. Now, I think the critique has paid off, that some donors are beginning to shift. If we look at, for instance, British Academy, sorry, that's my son in the background. If we look at British Academy, for instance, changing the criteria and saying co-PIs are allowed to be on projects, particularly in projects that involve partnerships between the Global North and South. So this is a very healthy thing to have. In Lebanon, there are many, many challenges. And one of the challenges is, the limited funding, the short-term funding. Rita Gashaman and the other colleagues probably Rola will talk about them, just published a paper on research ethics in the global, the challenges that we have. And the whole setup in terms of how you build your career, your promotion. It doesn't encourage you to do the research that is necessarily the most pertinent kind of research for your area and for your setting. So in terms of academia, there are many structural barriers that don't really promote local knowledge and local knowledge production, because you're publishing for your promotion. You need to publish in the global North journals in a language that no one will read it. And Nahid Al-Hadan has a nice quote in one of her articles. She says, quoting a Palestinian child, saying, I heard my voice in English and I heard it in French, but it never came back to me in Arabic. So, and this is a very important point about how, but also, how, the knowledge that we produce. So obviously now in Lebanon, the crisis is really terrible. We don't have electricity that much, people, the good news is that we rely more on solar panel, which is really good, but still many people, particularly in urban areas, cannot have solar panel. So we have lots of structural issues that are a challenge, and it worries me, as the cost of education is going to be very expensive. Who's going to be able to invest in social sciences over a period of time, and who's going to invest in building a research career? So this is another issue that this is why I think, particularly now in Lebanon, it's super important to invest in emerging scholars and building that kind of a new generation that is contributing to these critical debates. At the same time, I think we have a huge asset in terms of the human resources. The other day I was interviewing for scholarships, and the bright people that I met, 20 years old, who are so engaged and so connected and so knowledgeable, because in this age, everyone can access knowledge to some extent. Obviously, they can't access, many of the university and academic journals because they can't access them because of the cost. But if they are able to connect more than before. But there's another, I'm interested today to talk more about also the challenges that are in the global North. Because it's amazing how, even despite when you think that you broke some of the barriers, the structure and the culture of how people or other academics perceive you as an academic of the global South, it's just appalling, It's always, you're never going to be on the same equal par of them. And there's this hierarchy that is deeply embedded.
Unfortunately, I think we've temporarily lost Maha. I hope she's able to rejoin us very soon. That really underscores these questions of infrastructure and the importance of that. And on Maha's last point, in terms of these not just being dynamics that exist within the global South, but what are the dynamics of the educational sector, the research sector in Canada that reproduces these asymmetries in terms of what are the incentive structures that currently exist that lead researchers in the global North to engage in partnerships in the way that they do. And something that I hope we'll be able to continue the conversation with Maha is very much around the question of how the research ethics application process, whenever a researcher applies for research ethics, are there steps that can be introduced to that process to help to ensure that researchers ask these questions about access to resources and questions of power. But before I turn to Jorn and to Rula, just to underscore something that Maha suggested to us, is that we can think of these structures as a series of concentric rings. At the core, there are questions of accessing resources, who can apply, who can manage funds. There are then the question, sort of the outer core of those, which are, how does the educational sector allow or support opportunities for progressive understandings of research relationships? But then there's sort of an outer set of structural issues that go well beyond what the field of refugee and forced migration itself can engage with, which are all of these questions around investments in post-secondary, the post-secondary sector, social sciences research. And that's certainly not limited to the global South, although it's significant. It becomes in the context of East Africa that I know best, and Rula, we've discussed this in the context of the Middle East. How do you get the importance of research to be present on development agendas, on conversations between national governments and as in their normal budgetary process? But this also very much relates to the question of the global north as well. Colleagues in the UK will know full well what happens when government funding changes, that research budgets get summarily slashed. But there are these small moments of change. Maha mentioned how, I mentioned Rula because this is something that we've been talking about how, the British Academy now allows co-principal applicants, co-principal investigator arrangements for projects that cross the North-South divide. In Canada, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada now allows co-PI arrangements on some of its largest grants, like the partnership grant, which is what supports the work of LERRN. So there are these moments of change that we're starting to see, and it's in the spirit of identifying and amplifying those moments of change that I'm keen to now turn to Jorn and to Rula. Jorn, let me start with you, and with the work of the German Development Institute that's been really trying to encourage these kinds of conversations, not only in building the sector of refugee and forced migration studies in Germany in the past 5 or 7 years, if not longer, but also on this question of internationalizing the field of refugee and forced migration studies. We heard at the International Studies Association Roundtable on Localization, your colleague Rose Jaji, who's also in the audience today, on the value and the practicalities of localization. So Jorn, let me give the floor to you from your perspective and your experience with the German Development Institute. What are the structures that are changing, and what are the structures that need to change? Jorn, let me give the floor to you, please.
Thank you, James. And let me start by saying that I'm really honored to be here today. It's a great opportunity. Thank you so much for having me. First, I couldn't agree more with basically all Maha just said from her perspective, just looking at it kind of from the other side of the coin, as if we like it or not, usually from a German institution as much as from a Canadian institution, I would guess. We are so far on the more kind of financially, infrastructure-wise, comfortable side of things, and then have to face many of these hurdles, many of these obstacles only at a secondary rate. My impression is really to underscore that in a way the whole industry of research has to review its modes of operation. And that is certainly true for refugee and forced migration research, but it's certainly also true for science more generally, and in particular for social science. It starts with exactly one point that Maha already mentioned, the perception of if we do research, and for an institute like the German Development Institute, that's been our kind of core identity for the past 6 decades. If as an institution you are working on issues taking place or affecting to a large degree countries in the global south, there has for a long time been the tendency to define the research topic, then travel somewhere to do the field research, then find someone to support you. Then if you like them, you said, wow, great, there are smart people down there. And then travel back with the data and send them nice regards and a nice acknowledgement in your journal article. And that was about it. Now, I think we're all aware that that has begun to change, but far more has to happen actually for that change to be far more fundamental. And that is, for example, I mean, just when we did some refugee-related research in Ethiopia over the past 2 years, when we started that particular type of research, we were met with some kind of disbelief by potential partners in Ethiopia, and we approached them with whom we were telling, this is the type of idea we are having, and this is the type of research we would like to do, that we were not offering terms of reference for a commissioned study that they should do on our behalf, but that we were actually seeking partners with whom to think about the best ways to do the research and approach it in a different way. But obviously that also comes with not only, I'm not saying it is their fault. What I'm saying is the structures that we are all used to, and the structures that were fed by a certain type of funding arrangements, they continue to exist, and to overcome that is a far larger task. It has to do with the incentive structures that exist also, especially in the northern academia, just as you mentioned, James. There is not necessarily much to be gained for a emerging scholar in a northern university from intensive engagement with partners in Ghana, Ethiopia, in writing papers that are readable and worth reading for an audience in Ghana or Ethiopia, rather than an audience, an academic audience in the global north in peer-reviewed journals. But this is exactly what your tenure commission or whatever will look for. And so what are the incentive structures that we are facing, and how do we have to change those? And I think looking into what gets you promotion in social science is one of those issues. And one of the others, obviously, then is what are the funding structures that exist for research projects? And perhaps two observations on this before I conclude. James, you just mentioned some first starts, beginnings of where funding institutions do things differently now, of allowing for co-PIs from the global south, which I think is much needed. Many others will still have to follow, and will have to understand that for a good, not only ethically decent, but also from a qualitative perspective, for good research, we will need to have other types of partnerships that are no longer of the type that someone in the north develops a project and someone in the south contributes to making it happen, but that there is much to be gained from a joint perspective at the very early stages of designing research, of asking questions, of thinking about ways to do it. There is a capacity building component in it, but after a while, as a northern researcher, you pretty soon learn that there's as much for you to learn from your southern partners as there may be for southern partners to learn from you. So it's a mutual relationship of learning. And I see there is much more for us to do in the area of lobbying for this. But I also see that some things are already happening outside the field of refugee research, or not necessarily as an integral component of refugee research in this area. The German Education and Science Ministry, for example, has started to fund so-called Merian centers of social science and humanities research over the past years, 5 centers in different parts of the world that are supposed to do exactly that. They are established in countries, in Ghana, in Mexico, in India, and they exist there. They are staffed with academics from there, plus academics from all over the world. and they're set up exactly to link research that's happening there with researchers from all over the world. And these are opportunities, for example, where I feel that from a refugee and forced migration research perspective, we can and should be engaging far more. And one final word has to do with the types of funding arrangements. I think we're all used to these types of calls for competitive funding out there that we engage in, but there is an element, and it has been mentioned before, of infrastructure needs that actually has to be in place before partners can actually realistically on a permanent basis compete on this market. So you can help once in a while for them to do this, but in order for that to actually be a realistic opportunity, you need an infrastructure in place first, just as my institution has an infrastructure that exists, as Carleton University has one, and so on and so forth. And many universities in many parts of the world have little more in basic funding than just the buildings they may have, and even have to make sure that they get the salaries of their staff in from research funding. So they depend so much to a degree on that funding that they have to take whatever they can get, which is not the best place to start from. This is why initiatives that fund chairs, that fund institutions on a more permanent basis are so welcome, because then they offer the opportunity to build on that with partnerships that engage in competitive funding.
No, Jorn, I think that's just such critical points that you take, and on the point of infrastructure, just to let everyone know that the team's working very hard behind the scenes to get Maha back on the call, as if to emphasize the point. With Maha joining from southern Lebanon and the challenges of infrastructure, we regrettably are having this illustrated to us in real time. But Jorn, there are three key points that I would take away from what you've said. And the first is this idea of thinking about incentive structures and there's a very fine balance here, because on the one hand we say we don't want the agenda to be prescribed by donors, but at the other hand there is an agreement that the role that funding can play to bring about change in the way that research happens. And so to really understand that incentive structure is really important. But what I really want to underscore from your intervention is a question, we'll follow up on this in a moment, is the value proposition of this kind of research. You made the point, it's not just an ethical imperative. I mean, it's the right thing to do, but it's also a good thing to do because it leads to better research. And this is what we found. I've mentioned Mark Akello on the call with the Dadaab Response Association. When the researchers who live and work in the Dadaab refugee complex can set the agenda of researching refugee education in that context, the questions that are asked and the research that's produced sheds light on these dynamics in ways that we would never have imagined otherwise, and certainly weren't otherwise present on the agenda. But then the third point is how there are changes in fields outside of refugee and forced migration studies is not the first field to have encountered these challenges. And so the question is, what are the lessons that we can learn from what has worked or what has not worked in other related fields, and how do we build on that experience? And that's the perfect moment to bring in Rula, because Rula, these questions are baked into the DNA of IDRC. This is what IDRC does. And so many of our conversations have been, how do we learn for refugee and forced migration studies as a field? How do we learn what has worked elsewhere? So Rula, and wonderful to have Maha, back on the call with us. But Rula, let me go to you on these questions, and then Maha, I'll give you the chance to if there are any final thoughts from your intervention before we go to a more open discussion. But Rula, let me give the floor to you, please.
Thanks a lot, James. Thanks to the LERRN team. Thanks to Susan. Okay, wow. I mean, I don't know where to start. There is a lot to unpack, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's an honor to be with all these great panelists today. I learn from you guys every day. So I mean, where do I want to start? As you said, James, I mean, we're a different kind of donor, and I don't mean to make a plug for IDRC, but part of IDRC's DNA is to actually support researchers in the global south. This is our mandate, and our 50 years of operation. Core to our history of funding is to support local communities to generate inclusive and sustainable solutions that are critical not only to their local realities, but also that inform and impact global challenges. And I say that because, I mean, it's wonderful to be working in an institution that really always gives priority to global South researchers. But given all that's been discussed about structural transformation of research and research funding processes, there are a lot of things that we are learning every day, and we continue to learn, and we also have to really make an effort to change. So I want to make a couple of points, maybe to echo or maybe to address some of the points that were raised by my panelists before me. A couple of points, and I've just jotted down in no particular order, but the issue of, I mean, we all talk about today decolonizing knowledge and localization of research, which means really a structural transformation of power relations and in how we look at the knowledge economy and the production of knowledge. We need to change our terms of engagement when it comes to understanding what knowledge is. Most times we tend to refer to knowledge tend to be Western centric, and we need to start kind of unpacking what knowledge is valuable to local context and how can knowledge be understood in its broadest sense, not only pure academic research that goes into journals that are, you know, most of the times not really open access anyway. So we need to first understand and enlarge the way we understand what knowledge is, what valuable knowledge is, and go away from being so Western centric. There's tons of examples in the forced displacement field about how most of the research that is quoted and referred to comes from the global north, while the majority of research, I mean, we know that if you look at publications such as international relations, I just read recently, there's not even 5 to 10% of non-Western contributors to some of the major journals in international relations. So this doesn't only apply to the fields of forced displacement. So we need to really enlarge our understanding of what knowledge is that is valuable and relevant and pertinent to local and context. The second thing I want to say is, I mean, as a donor, I mean, as a research funder, even though we do fund global South researchers in the majority of the work that we do, we also are accountable to our taxpayers. Our funding comes from taxpayers, and we have this idea about how do we assess results and how do we understand results. Many people many donors refer to, I mean, use the approach of results-based management as an approach. IDRC uses more the outcome mapping approach, which is broader and more comprehensive. But I say this because what's really important is for us as donors to not be rigid about assessing success and how it is defined, especially in context of heightened vulnerabilities where we all are working. So we do need a nuanced understanding of what success means. It will look differently between one context and another. It should be very specific. It should be self-defined and contextualized ultimately. But it still has to allow us to connect it to some guiding principles and markers around human rights, around inclusivity, and around participation, etc. So this is a debate that is ongoing. How do we define success? And we should really be not rigid about this is successful, this is not, but really connect to the local context. Another point I want to quickly make is related to the issue of success is also being aware of power imbalances, not only between global North and South, but also among Southern researchers and Southern institutional setup. And not to simplify what local means. And this is a point that Maha makes all the time. Maybe localization is the wrong term. Maybe contextualization is the better term. I don't know. I think this is a debate that's going to be ongoing. But the point is, we cannot simplify what local is, and we really need to be very conscious of how we define, how we work with different local actors, and try to also address power imbalances in the global South, including academic institutions within academic institutions. So that's my second point. I want to make a point about we must collectively make an effort, not only global South researchers, but also us in the global, and this is something we constantly discuss, and James, you alluded to it, the issue of how do we really understand policy influence and policy impact in contexts where there is limited policy space, where there is failed governance, where there is weak governance, where there is increasing limited restrictions on freedom of expression and freedom of speech. We haven't done this really well, I don't think, as donors. I think, and I can't speak for all donors, I'm just making general remarks based on my decades of experience working in this field. It seems to me we work very well with civil society and help them to try to make a difference and have an impact on a policy, in policy circles and policy making, decision making circles. And maybe we haven't yet really figured out how to seriously engage in a discussion with policymakers, unpack who the policymakers are, who the actors of change are amongst policymakers. And I think this is the onus is not only on donors, but also on global South researchers. And the last thing I will say is about something that's also been mentioned before, is about investing in individuals versus institutions. And I think more and more there are efforts to think beyond individual support, but also think of institutional structures. And I go here to our example of funding research chairs. This is one example. This is not a new example. We've done this. We do this for a long time in other fields and sectors. But trying to invest in existing institutions, such as universities, for example, is something we should do more systematically. IDRC has funded a huge initiative, $150 million worth of a think tank initiative dedicated to supporting really researchers in the global South and think tanks in the global South. Ford Foundation and Asfari Foundation are thinking about a major initiative to support CSO capacity. So there are a lot of efforts to think about supporting institutional kind of approaches, because we have to use local institutions in a way to train the trainers. Local institutions become the hubs that can actually impact individual researchers as well as other institutions. We need to fund more of the shirks of the regions where we work. In the Arab world, we have this excellent example of the Arab Council on Social Sciences, for example, that works not only with individual institutions, but works with now becoming more and more working with NGOs. But also to say that when I talk about power imbalances in the global South, and we refer to academic institutions in the South as an example, it's a bet for us to think and to push the role of academia, not only as academic, but really to be a connector and facilitator between community and between policy. And this is a role that even global North and universities don't have. I think it's interesting to push these institutions that have existed for a long time to think differently about their role, that brings this connection, that become a mirror of society and community, and yet a very interesting connector to policy. I will stop there. Lots of things to discuss, and thanks.
Thank you. No, Rula, thank you so much. And you're right. I mean, I think this conversation just helps us better appreciate the contours of the issue, and as opposed to resolving any of them. And Maha, welcome back to the call. Thank you for being able to rejoin us. We lost you on the call just at the moment where you were talking about the need to really appreciate and respond to sort of some of the technical limitations. And so it was as if to punctuate your point that we lost you from southern Lebanon. But Rula, I just want to underscore a point from Rula, and then to fill you in, Maha, on a point that Jorn raised that I think links quite well. And then I'd like to turn it to you if there are points that you wanted to share at the end of your intervention, but also to lead us in this next round of discussion before I then open it up to others that want to join in. Rula, you make the point about this notion of the value proposition, and you make it in two ways, that public funds, whether it's SSHRC here in Canada, whether it's IDRC, it's taxpayers' dollars, right? That is being invested in research. And if the argument is about investing public funds in the post-secondary structure, funds aren't limitless, and so it really is beholden on the research community, I think, to make that case about the value proposition, that it's not just the ethical argument of investing in a new kind of research and to be more ethical in that way, but very much to be able to point to moments where doing this new kind of research is in the interest of the actors, that the back to the origins of the university thousands of years, or more than 1,000 years ago, it was societies put aside a surplus of resources for certain individuals in society to be able to reflect on issues that are of wider societal importance. So Rula, the 2 points that you made at the beginning and the end of your intervention, not only about the responsibility, donors' responsibility towards taxpayers, but also to be able to demonstrate that research then has the kind of impact that actually brings us back full circle, that justifies that investment in the first place. Now, that's a very neoliberal argument that I've just made, but I wonder if it's that kind of thinking that really needs to be part of our engagement with this topic, because it's not just about access to research funding, it's infrastructure, it's salaries. But as we've said, and Maha, this is the point where we lost you from the call, that these are not just issues in particular regions of the global south. These are issues within the global north as well, in terms of the incentive structures and in terms of these perverse externalities that are created, that drive people to engage in these research questions in a very transactional and tokenistic way. So Maha, let me give the floor back to you if there's any point that you want to conclude with from your intervention. But I do then want to open up this question about how do we make this value proposition? And I pose that to you, Maha, but also to Rula and Jorn and Susan, if you want to come back in on this. How do we make the case that it's not just an ethical question of funding research and institutions differently, but there's a value proposition to be made that it's a worthwhile area to invest arguably scarce public funds. So Maha, let me give the floor back to you, and then I'll open it up for a wider conversation. Maha, welcome back, and over to you.
Thanks. Wow, there are so many issues to pick on and highlight. There is a couple of points, when Rhoda was highlighting the role of institutions. This is very important, very, very important, because I think academia worldwide has become kind of an individual project, in the sense of like, we're working for ourselves, it's about, well, how far I'm going to go in this hierarchy. So as faculties, as departments, there's hardly a collaborative or this kind of like, we're into this together to do something. And I think COVID has showed the limitations on some of higher education sometimes, but at the same time, the huge potential that other universities can play. And I want here to highlight, for instance, the role of the state universities. I'm not part of a state university, and Rola knows it's very difficult, and you know, at least in Lebanon, the research capacity is very limited. The ability, there is potential. We had a collaboration with the Lebanese university, and they were the first people to jump on a potential collaboration to respond to COVID-19 by offering support for teachers through MOOCs, etc. There is a potential, but the structure, I think we have a real issue with the structure of the university, the role of academic, the identity of academics, and what Rola was talking about, like how do you also connect research to policy and practice? If you say this, you're seen as a populist, academic and not a very serious academic. So this is why I think there's a culture that we're dealing with, but also it's super important. What Rola highlighted is the role of institutions. There are many points to pick on, but the issue of value for research, and this is what I think is it requires a shift in culture. And unfortunately, for the past 20, 30 years or more, we have a very neoliberal kind of academia that has graduated generations that are very transactional. You know, it's you're in this by yourself. You have to get your publications out and be promoted. So this is a very important thing. There's one last point I want to mention before we open the discussion, because it's really important that we hear from everyone and hear their input. It's also the role of how we can build a structure that improves research capacity in the sense of like PhDs and masters program. And this is where I think we have a huge problem. At least some of the, like the most active universities, most of them don't have PhD programs. So you automatically, you have this brain drain of very bright scholars who leave. I mean, some of them come back, but I think this is, how do you develop a localized research agenda when you don't have the capacity to have a local research agenda? So this is why I think we need to invest more in research-based master's programs, but also PhD programs, etc. I'll stop here, knowing that there are many other points to pick on.
No, and Maha, I think that really, it really encapsulates the scale of the challenge, where we're talking about, changing the very structure of academia, and Rula, it goes to your point about, conducting research that has impact beyond the academy. And Jorn, this has been central to the work of the German Development Institute, and within the field of refugee and forced migration studies, this notion of the dual imperative, David Turton's ethical admonishment that research on issues of human displacement are only ethically justifiable. And part of the goal of that research is to address those sources of displacement, fundamentally. So, do we have a disconnect, not only sort of at a structural funding level, but I certainly see this, and colleagues in Canada have commented on it, and we see this from a place of profound privilege, where our salaries are covered by the public, mostly by the public purse, but yet we see that the incentive structure that's put in place is very much about publishing in a very particular kind of journal, sole authored publications as opposed to co-authored publications, because these are the boxes to tick to be able to be eligible for tenure, for promotion, for that kind of recognition, and to develop the profile that then makes you competitive for these large research grants. So there's this feedback loop that privileges the individual over a more collective approach. So, within this, let me open up the floor really on those two questions. One, the value proposition of doing research in a different way, and where do we begin in challenging these incentive structures that produce a particular kind of research and this very transactional and tokenistic approach to research collaboration? Are there examples that we can point to of where these structures have begun to change? Let me open it up. Who wants to jump in on the question of where are there moments where this value proposition has been made? Are there lessons we can learn from? Are there opportunities for change that we can build upon? Rula, you've unmuted. Let me pass the floor to you, please.
Yeah, I mean, very quickly, I don't know if it's a new point, but I want to say that COVID has been an opportunity as well as a disaster globally. But I think it just shows that inability to go to the global south and conduct research the traditional way. Jorn, you mentioned, you know, we get funding for research in the north, we go to the south. I think COVID has highlighted and stressed the importance of global south and local contextual researchers. And I think this is an opportunity we should seize to begin this kind of more structural transformation. And kind of to consider that, you know, the glass is half full. There's more and more initiatives where donors are coming together to try to work together to have a bigger impact in specific contexts, especially of heightened vulnerability. And I think it's to be supported. I mean, the point is, how can, given research funding and just generally development funding is shrinking ultimately within national budgets, we have to think out of the box, and we have to think together to have a greater impact on strengthening the ability of Global South researchers to lead the agenda, to identify the problems, to identify the solutions. But I think we can play a very important role through our funding and our resources to really take out that knowledge from the context into other contexts. I mean, the onus is on us now to share best practices, to network researchers across the globe, across regions, from local municipality to a national context, understand successes. And I think this is where donors can use their dollars wisely. And I see more and more of these approaches as I see more and more of donors getting together. There's donor groups within countries. There's donor groups that are forming across thematics. And there are now Global South partners, for example, and I'll give the example of the Arab Council on Social Sciences, and I mentioned them before. Every time they have their annual meeting, they organize a group of donors to ACSS to discuss about issues of priority for the region itself, so that we learn from our Global South partners. So Global South partners have to also push the donors into telling us, hey, you're on the right track, you're not on the right track. I know it's not simple and it's not easy, and there's always a power relation when there's funding, but I think there are more and more creative ways that are taking place that are pushing the donors to think beyond just kind of their, you know, disperse funding, get a nice report, publish it, etc. I think we're in an era in innovation, and I really believe that COVID pushed us beyond that. I mean, look at this panel. How many nationalities are participating in this discussion? We never did that before. We had meetings and 50 people maybe came to the meeting. So I'll stop there. Other things to say, but anyway, I'll stop for now.
No, and Rula, that's a key point, and I want to come to Jorn on that, because you know there's a really striking parallel with conversations on refugee participation in the functioning of the regime. There's something that happened in that early moment of COVID when international actors were limited in their mobility and access, and as those actors were silenced, what we saw was something that had been happening all along but was underappreciated, which was the role of what refugee-led organizations were doing in providing social protection and assistance to their communities. And I think in a similar way, the early days of COVID and the inability for researchers from the north to, you know, flock down and engage in this extractive approach, Jorn, that you mentioned, you know, that it was that moment of humility. It was that moment of realization that, you know, the partners who live day to day in these environments are really, you know, they don't need the researchers from the north to come down and tell them what the research priorities are. And I think, you know, is it a question, just as in the refugee regime, we're talking about building back better after the pandemic, is the same perhaps true within the academic field? So Jorn, on that, let me give the floor to you, because I know this has been a very important part of the FFVT journey. And then Susan, I'd like to turn to your thoughts on this. So Jorn, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, James. Probably my response to your question is probably yes, and yes. Very much so. I mean, we started this FFVT journey in January 2020, and after 2 months, we got stuck in the corona pandemic situation. And with our own Ethiopia-related research here at the German Development Institute, we found ourselves in Ethiopia, basically, when the global travel broke down, basically. And after a while found that new ways of communicating opened up also new ways of not only communicating among ourselves in research teams with that included our partners in Ethiopia, but also in new ways of communicating our findings with those whom we wanted to hear about our findings. And those were policymakers both in Ethiopia and in Germany and Europe and so on and so forth. In that sense, I think there's a lot to be learned and taken away from this experience. At the same time, I think there's a broader picture to be taken into account, and I think Rola alluded to it when asked about this value proposition. Is it just only ethically good? No, it is far more than that. I mean, I think we are at a critical moment, and in Europe, maybe we sense that more than at any time in the past years at this very moment, where a global cooperation seems to be at a turning point. We are realizing we may have to deal with very problematic actors on the one hand, but on the other hand, we realize that old recipes of, I don't know, of Cold War Iron Curtains won't certainly help us solve the problems of the future. Climate change issues won't go away simply because we erect some Iron Curtain between countries that we wish to cooperate with and those that we don't wish to cooperate with, or governments that we don't wish to cooperate with. But many other global issues won't disappear that way, and that's certainly true for issues of refugees, whose situation is not only a humanitarian crisis for them, but solving these issues is an issue of global relevance, not only for the countries where they originate, not only for the countries that host them. So there's a lot of other issues where we understand that we need to enter into a new phase of global cooperation. But if we do so, and if we want to do so, the ways we interact and the ways we cooperate, they depend on how we understand the situation, how we define the situation, what are the narratives on which we build our cooperation, what are the narratives on which we build our understanding, not only of the problem, but also of potential solutions to the problem. But it's exactly these narratives that are shaped, or should be shaped, ideally, also by what science and what academic research can come up with. Policymakers, wise policymakers at least, when they spend part of their time actually shaping narratives, and that's a big part of what politicians are up to, they rely on knowledge that they cannot build themselves, they cannot create themselves. So what we are doing and the way we are helping to shape our societal understanding of what's going on has impact on how impactful our solutions can actually be. And in that sense, if we understand that the way we, for example, understand refugee issues and refugee problems is far more influential, far more instrumental, far more impactful, if we take into account the knowledge, the perspectives of researchers in many other countries, then I think we can make a strong case that this has also a long-term benefit for the societies that at this point in time are the ones that pay the bill of research. Well, that may even change in the years to come. That's another thing to keep in mind, that these relationships of the wealthy and the not so wealthy, they are not set in stone for forever.
Jorn, I'm somewhat breathless by the scale of what you're saying, but I fully agree. And I really want to underscore this point that, you know, we're at a moment within the history of the international system where there's this struggle between a model based on rules and cooperation and a model that has a very different vision for the world. And I think the point that you make is while the case is being made for new forms of cooperation, it needs to be forms of cooperation that are seen to be reflective of the broad range of interests and actors that are in the international system, not just the powerful few. It's not just about reproducing systems that were created at the end of World War II, which ossify these forms of hegemony within the world. And so the context within which you place this conversation is incredibly timely and profoundly urgent. And I think it's important for us to take away from this conversation that this isn't just an abstract theoretical question, but one of profound urgency. And I thank you for that. Susan, I want to bring you into the conversation because this has been part of the RRN's journey very much. There are then a couple of questions in the Q&A box that I'd like to use that actually take us to a next part of this conversation in a very powerful way. So Susan, over to you, please.
Thank you. I just want to, again, thanks Jorn for his comments. And I think what Rulo has been saying, how funders are getting together, I just want to comment about how we're seeing researchers getting together. That COVID has given us that. So we're having only webinars, but we have the International Association for Studies in Forced Migration being hosted in Brazil, but people will be gathering. Last time it was in Ghana. So people gathered globally to participate. It's not as great, perhaps it's in person, but I think we're having opportunities for engagement. I've also, colleagues in East Africa recently hosted a conference, and for the social workers in that area, those who were able to get there locally went, but they did it online. So those of us in the West who are not able to get there were able to participate. So I think we're seeing these sort of new, what are these new hybrid ways of trying to engage at more inclusive ways that allow everybody to participate and being aware again of the hierarchies. And I think Jorn has dealt that very well. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. And I think that's such a critical point that, if there is a moment, and it goes to your point, because, while here in where I sit, the government is saying pandemic is over, conditions are loosening, you can travel again, but the reality is so different, in so many places around the world. But Susan, it was really heartening for me to see that when the International Association for the Study of Forced Migration put out the call on partners that were willing to host the conference in 2024, there was that requirement that you needed to be able to demonstrate how you could support at minimum a hybrid conference. Because what we've learned from the pandemic is that when you open up spaces, that you address issues of resources to travel, visa permissions to travel, safety to travel. And so, it raises the question of how do we take from this terrible 2 years, how do we make that lemonade from the lemons that we've been given? How do we take the best from this experience and use that as proof on how the field can function in a way that's more responsive? But let me pose perhaps a final question to all of you, which builds from this conversation but also links in questions that we've been seeing in the Q&A box. We had a very specific question from Osama Salim, a wonderful friend and colleague who spoke at the CARFMS conference of 2018 at Carleton University. He's now in Berlin, and Jorn, it was a question to you, and we can follow up by email on how individuals who are not in academia can engage with the work of the FFVT. But I think it's a question to all of us that we realize that these questions that we're raising are not questions that can be raised by donors and academia alone. These are questions that need to be raised as part of a broader public debate. There's a question from Adnan in the Q&A box about how do we engage those donors that have been on the sidelines. So, for example, Arab Gulf states, right? So sources of resources that are there. And I know, Rula, this has been part of your thinking. So maybe a question to you. There are those donors that are perhaps reluctant, have not dipped their toe into this conversation. So, how do we broaden the community of donors that are asking these questions? But then a question from Fatan, who I believe is joining us from Montreal. Fatan, the wonderful work that you do on these questions, and that for Fatan, it prompts the question, and I'll read it here, that the asymmetries of power that have been mentioned describe so well the need not only to decolonize the field, but to democratize the field. That the race for power in academia between and within institutions needs to be part of this debate. And I think that's been flagged. That the pressure on scholars to publish and gain recognition and advancement in their careers becomes more important than the initial ethical aim of doing research, the common good, social justice, giving voice to the voiceless. This becomes an even greater challenge for scholars in the global south who lack these basic resources and the challenges of Maha being connected and disconnected. So maybe Susan, to you and also to you, Maha, a question of how can we work within the academy to change these structures of recognition and competition? How is it that we're able to work within the discipline to change these dynamics? Jorn, perhaps a question to you on how we engage broader publics on these questions, how these questions of new forms of global cooperation, these questions about public investments in the sector. These are questions that need public engagement, need those taxpayers to be involved. And that same question, I think, to you, Rula, but then also, Rula, your work within the region on identifying that there are donors who need to be part of this conversation and currently aren't. So how do we make the case to them? So let me pose that as an opportunity for you to offer some final words and maybe some final reflections on where we go from here within this conversation to be able to bring us to a conclusion of this webinar with the time that we have left. And Maha, if I may, while we still have you on the line, could we start with you? Where do you see opportunities for us to go next within this conversation with these challenges that we've identified? Maha, if I can, let me give the floor to you, please.
Hi, James. Sorry, I'm not going to connect the video just in case I lose you again. Oh, where to start? I mean, obviously, it's we have a neoliberal culture in universities that we want to challenge, and this is super important. But it's it's very, very hard to do this. I mean, I just came from England, and there was a strike. Teachers. Oh, oops. Hello. Can you hear me again? Yeah.
We can hear you, Maha. Go ahead, please.
And there was a strike, but there was very limited engagement with this, with the challenging, the exploitation also of academics, which is pushing more and more outside. But in the global south, I find it very interesting that also we're seeing more research centers growing, kind of like on the side of universities, because in some ways, the universities, particularly in some countries, are more like teaching, just for teaching rather than doing research. And this is something that, because either they lack resources or because this is the main, criteria, or if you're a professor at LAU, you have to teach 6 courses. What time do you have left to do anything else? So in a way, the job description and the responsibilities attached to it limit and squeeze the place and spaces for having, this opportunity to conduct research, let alone engaging with research ethics and how do you make relevant research. And this has been always a key issue. Like when I look, for instance, at education, you look at Lebanon, how many education is doing research on education historically in public schools, or looking at educational inequalities. You study abroad, your research agenda becomes more connected to the academic debates abroad, and this is one of the challenges that we have. I just want to finish with one main point: is we need to bring. I mean, research ethics cannot be just still about protecting institutions or just anonymous, having anonymous participants, etc. Research ethics has to also put the question of research for what, for whom, what kind of knowledge we're producing, how will this knowledge travel, to whom it will benefit. This has to become a core component of the discussion. Now, in terms of changing the hierarchy within the university, changing the criteria of how we're assessed, ranked, evaluated, I mean, this is a much bigger challenge. But I think also in migration, we have excellent networks research networks that are really, really, I think that's what's making this field more vibrant than other areas. And I think this is a great space to act, from. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maha. And let me just say, this question of how the research ethics process can be a site of change is something that with Maha's engagement that we're going to be following with LERRN next year. So stay tuned for that. I'll also ask Richard or Rachel to put the link to IASFM in the chat box. Stay tuned for their conference, which is coming up in the first week of August, where many of these issues I know will be continued. Jorn or Rula, which one of you would like to offer your point? Jorn is ceding the floor, Rula, to you. Rula, some thoughts from you, and then we'll go to Jorn, and then I'll give the last word to you, Susan. Go ahead, Rula.
Thank you. Very quickly, I will say two things. I can't comment on everything that was asked, but I see great opportunities in investing in institutions rather than creating new institutions. We need to rethink how institutions can work better to communicate, to connect policy to practice, to academia, to knowledge generation. And the second point I will make very quickly is about the donor landscape. And I would say we need to think about how to engage with the private sector. Yes, there are a lot of donors out there, but a lot of donors, bilateral donors, come with heavy political agendas, especially in our region, actually. But it doesn't mean we don't want to work with them, but I think we also need to open up to the private sector. There's great potential and possibilities there.
Thank you, Rula. I like the note of possibilities. Jorn, over to you, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Two quick thoughts to add. First, on the question of how to engage with kind of actors outside that academic research bubble, and perhaps even beyond policymakers that are being addressed with policy advice. That's certainly a topic that I think is important to keep in mind in a situation whereby, as in Germany right now, with millions of Ukrainian refugees coming into other European countries, and Germany being one of them, and the second probably after Poland. There is obviously a huge interest now also on the part of, for example, all kinds of civil society organizations, local organizations, local governments, and so on and so forth, to engage and to learn. And there is a lot of engagement. There's a lot of learning going on. It has been since the 2015-2016 refugee influx from the Middle East. And in that sense, I think we should view this also as opportunities to strengthen these linkages. And at the same time, it shows also kind of responsibilities. I mean, what we see right now with the European Union having activated its temporary protection directive for refugees from Ukraine, which gives them immediate residence permit, immediate access to the labor market, immediate access to education and social security systems in the EU hosting countries. What we have, in a way, is what we called for other refugee situations in the past. And now what we need to do is do very good research on what are the effects and what are the difference in the effects of this. Does it hold what we hoped for? When it did not, when it does not, what are the reasons for it? So there's a lot we can learn now, and we must learn now, to also show the relevance not only of this research, but also of these approaches, and improve those approaches. And the other point, very quickly, as we all said so much about the incentive systems in the academic world and the research world, if you are in a situation, as I am here at my institute and some others are, where there may be things to gain, but at the end of the day, I am in a secure position. We should also not forget that there are things that we can do and that we can decide in certain positions, especially if you are at a more established level of your career. And we should use these opportunities. Maybe that comes at the cost of losing some extra stars somewhere. but it comes at the benefit of knowing that you're doing the right thing with the right people, and it's a lot of fun, and it's joyful, and it makes you feel better. It's as easy as that sometimes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Jörn, and I really appreciate that reflection. Susan, let me give the floor to you for our penultimate words. Susan, over to you, please.
Oh, so much wonderful things been said. I just want to reinforce what you were saying also, that this more senior scholars, it's a time also to mentor, support, and address the changes. For instance, the changes in tenure requirements for scholars. They, to look not just at the number of articles you're producing, but how are they being produced? What were the ethics behind it, and how are they being engaged? And also to look at the partnerships that have been formed. So don't count the number of publications, but how are these relationships formed, and who have they engaged with and globally, and how have they advanced knowledge and issues around social justice. So I think, and that's up, I think, to those who have the security of tenure to make those changes. Just a final point, I just want to, creating these spaces has been so important and valuable. And I think to be able to do this in an ongoing way, I'm curious about how we've always relied on in-person faces in order to establish relationships, but it feels that it's happening virtually a bit. So I think, and I recognize the limitations that, Mahas are coming in and out. So again, there are differentials in terms of power and hierarchy that Mahas have addressed. And I think, again, we in the North, so-called North, need to really begin to look at addressing, and the more experienced scholars need to take that on. Thank you, everyone, for this. It's been a great experience.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. I think that's the perfect note on which to end. Rula has a wonderful way of ending conversations by saying "to be continued," and I think this is, so critical. What we have heard, Susan, from you, but from Maha, from Jörn, and from Rula, is, the scale of the change that's needed, but the opportunities and these tentative steps towards change that we're starting to see. I think that I feel quite, the scale of what's needed is significant, but the opportunity is real. And I, for one, feel quite empowered by this conversation, not only to rethink about my own privilege and positionality, and I encourage everyone in the audience to consider doing likewise, but really the value of what it is that we're doing, and something that would never come up on an academic checklist of academic productivity, contributing to a conversation like this. But Jörn, to echo your point, not only is it the right thing to do, it's an awful lot of fun. And having the chance to be able to engage in this conversation with all of you is a real privilege. And I know that you've taken time out of your busy days to do it. So Maha and Jörn and Rula, thank you for your incredible contributions. Lots more to discuss. Susan, as always, I learned so much from your insights and perspective. Thank you for your role in this panel, but the work of the RRN and the foundation that lays for so many of these conversations. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining us. But as this is the last in the series for this academic year, in the LERRN-RRN webinar series on ethics in forced migration research, let me say a very special word of thanks to everyone in the RRN team for contributing to this conversation, to this series. Not only Susan, but Julie, Dina Taha, many colleagues, Haley Britton and others at York University and beyond. A sincere thanks to everyone in the LERRN team for making the magic happen, not only during the webinar, but afterwards. Stay tuned for the report and the recording of this session, something that I will be watching again and again, I know. There's the link there to be able to subscribe to the LERRN newsletter to learn more about the work and future opportunities. But let me say a special word of thanks at the end of this webinar series to Rachel McNally, a magnificent PhD student at Carleton University and a really valued member of the LERRN team, who has coordinated the series, has led in our thinking of the conversation that can be sustained across sessions. So to the entire LERRN team and the technical support, but a special word of thanks to Rachel. Thank you so much for making this webinar series possible. You've encouraged us to continue to ask these hard questions and realize that change is indeed possible. So with that, wherever you're joining us from, please stay safe and stay well. Continue the conversation online. Take good care, everyone. Thank you.